Frank didn't belong in the world anymore. Once, a long time ago, he had been part of something, family, friends, responsibility, but the world had a way of grinding people down, and Frank had been worn to nothing. He'd spent years building a life in a place where no one could reach him, high in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. Silence didn't judge. Silence didn't betray. People, though, people were selfish. People took until there was nothing left to view. Frank had given everything once: his time, his energy, his trust. First to the military, where they'd trained him to follow orders, to survive. Then, later, to a woman who promised she'd always be there. She hadn't been. War took its toll. The things he'd seen, the things he'd done, they changed him. The man who came back wasn't the same man who had left, and she hadn't wanted the version of him that returned. At first, she tried. But soon, her voice had grown distant, her touch colder. Then came the lies, the quiet betrayals. And finally, she had moved on. He was just a ghost she no longer recognized. So he left. He traded city lights for the endless stretch of pine and snow, for the quiet hum of the wind against the mountains. He built his own cabin, chopped his own wood, and let the rest of the world fade into something distant, something irrelevant. Here, in the wilderness, he didn't have to be Frank the soldier or Frank the abandoned. He was just a man with his hands in the earth, with fire in his hearth, with no one left to disappoint and no one left to betray him. And that was fine, or at least that's what he told himself. Then the sky caught fire. Frank had been outside splitting wood when the first explosion hit. The shockwave rattled the trees, knocking fresh powder from their branches in thick cascades. A second later, a blinding streak of blue cut across the sky, burning against the darkness before slamming into the forest beyond his cabin. For a moment he just stood there, breath curling in the icy air. His gut told him to ignore it. Whatever had crashed, it wasn't his problem. He lived out here to avoid problems, not invite them to his doorstep. But his feet were already moving. He grabbed his rifle and flashlight, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the impact site. The scent of scorched pine filled the air, a thick, acrid tang that burned his nostrils. Steam curled in eerie tendrils where heat met ice, the snow around the crater rapidly melting into slush. And there, at the center of it all, something moved. Frank froze. It wasn't debris, it wasn't a satellite or a meteorite. It was a woman? No, not human. Her skin, an unnatural shade of deep blue, gleamed under the moonlight, smooth but marked with bruises and scratches. Her silver-white hair spilled across the snow, strands clinging to the frost. She was barely clothed, her torn garment clinging to her trembling form. Her breathing was shallow, her limbs twitching weakly. Frank tightened his grip on the rifle. Was she dangerous? Maybe, probably, but she was also freezing to death. He took a slow step closer. Her eyelids fluttered, and then, with what seemed like the last of her strength, her lips parted. A single word escaped in a breathy whisper. What? Frank's chest clenched. Her voice was weak, cracking with exhaustion, but undeniably human-like. He could walk away. He should walk away. But something in him refused to let that happen. With a sharp exhale, he slung the rifle over his back and knelt beside her. When his fingers brushed against her cheek, he hissed. She was cold. Not just winter cold, not just chilled, but the kind of cold that bit deep, that hollowed out life from the inside. She shouldn't have been alive. Her golden eyes cracked open, pupils thin and slitted like a predator's. Even in the dim light, they glowed. For a second, he thought she'd lash out, that she'd snarl or panic or try to claw at him. Instead, she just looked at him, dazed and barely conscious, but trusting, like she knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't going to let her die. And hell. Maybe she was right. Frank muttered a curse under his breath and scooped her up. She was impossibly light, her body curling into his chest the moment he lifted her. Clawed fingers gripped weakly at his jacket, as if trying to pull him closer. Every breath she took was shallow and rattling, as if each one might be her last. The wind howled through the trees as he started back toward the cabin, trudging through the deepening snow. For the first time in years, someone needed him again, and he had no idea if he was ready for that. Frank kicked the cabin door shut with his boot, his arm still full of trembling alien. The heat from the fireplace hit them instantly, a stark contrast to the frozen wasteland outside. The woman, or whatever she was, let out a small sound, not quite a sigh, more like something instinctual, like an animal that had finally found shelter. Her grip on his jacket loosened as he set her down near the fire, but she didn't let go completely. Clawed fingers remained tangled in the fabric, as if releasing him meant slipping back into the cold. Frank crouched beside her, peeling off his gloves. Up close, she was even stranger. Her skin, now less frostbitten, had a faint iridescent shimmer. Her hair wasn't just silver. It caught the firelight like molten metal. Her golden eyes flickered open for a second, glassy but aware, before slipping shut again. He pressed 2 fingers against her throat, searching for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. Too slow for a human heartbeat. She was alive, barely. Frank exhaled, glancing toward the window. Snow fell thick and heavy, erasing the crater outside. He wasn't sure what had crashed with her, whether it was a ship or something else, but it wouldn't matter soon. By morning, the storm would have buried any evidence. Turning back to her, he muttered, "Let's hope you don't bite." Carefully, he pried her fingers from his jacket, then reached for the thickest blanket he had. As he wrapped it around her, she shuddered violently and pressed deeper into the warmth. Her breathing evened out. Frank sat back on his heels, running a hand through his hair. What the hell was he supposed to do now? He lived out here to avoid problems, and this was a problem with a capital P. He had no idea what she was, where she'd come from, or if someone, or something, was coming after her. And yet, looking at her curled up by the fire, barely clinging to life, he knew he wasn't about to throw her back into the cold. His life might have been simple, but he wasn't heartless. Grumbling to himself, he stood and grabbed an old metal kettle, filling it with water from the storage barrel near the door. He set it over the fire, then rummaged through his cabinets. Tea wouldn't fix hypothermia, but it was better than nothing. As the water heated, he glanced at her again. She hadn't moved much, just tightened into a smaller ball beneath the blanket. The tips of her fingers peeked out, still faintly blue. Frank frowned. That wasn't good. He knelt beside her and reached out, hesitating before touching her hands. They were cold, not just chilled, but unnaturally cold, like she had ice running through her veins. Instinct told him to rub warmth back into them, but something about her biology felt off. He wasn't sure how much pressure her body could take. He had no idea if her circulation worked like a human's. Then, without warning, her fingers twitched. Frank pulled back, ready for a reaction, but she didn't lash out. Instead, she slowly, weakly reached toward him. Not in fear, not in aggression. In need. "Warmth," she whispered again, voice barely audible. Frank swallowed. His first instinct was to keep his distance. Whatever she wasn't human, but she was looking at him with something close to desperation. His hands curled into fists. He'd seen men on the battlefield look like that. Without overthinking it, he reached out and let her fingers brush against his. The difference was stark, his skin hot compared to hers. She gripped his hand weakly, her claws barely pressing against his palm. Then slowly she pulled his hand closer, pressing it against her own. Frank let her. They sat there in silence, the fire crackling beside them. The kettle whistled, breaking the moment. Frank eased his hand away and grabbed a mug, pouring the hot water over dried herbs. The scent of chamomile filled the air as he set the steaming cup near her. "Drink," he said, unsure if she even understood. Her eyes flickered open again, unfocused. She made no move to reach for the cup. Frank sighed, rubbing his jaw. Figures. He grabbed a spoon, scooped up some of the tea, and held it near her lips. She blinked sluggishly, then parted them just enough for the warm liquid to touch her tongue. Her entire body stiffened. Frank tensed, ready for a reaction, but instead of pulling away, she relaxed. A faint tremor passed through her, as if warmth itself was foreign to her body. She took another sip, and another. By the time she finished half the mug, her shivering had eased. Color, not much, but enough, returned to her face. Frank set the cup aside. "All right," he muttered, mostly to himself. "One problem at a time." He stood, stretching the tension from his back. Snow battered against the windows, the storm growing worse. Whatever had brought her here, wherever she was from, it didn't matter tonight. The clerk at the motel scrutinized Maddie, and they went up the stairs. He gestured towards the lobby. Right now, all that mattered was keeping her alive. Tomorrow, he'd figure out the rest. Frank had spent years in these mountains alone. He had built his life around silence, around the comforting certainty that no one would come knocking on his door, that he didn't have to answer to anyone. Out here, he owed nothing, expected nothing. Yet now, in the dim glow of the dying fire, he wasn't alone. And she was too close. Frank woke with a sharp inhale, his instincts firing before his mind could catch up. The weight against his chest was unfamiliar, the presence beside him unnatural. His fingers twitched toward the knife under his pillow, but the second his brain cleared, he froze. The alien woman? The one he had dragged from the snow, the one who had barely clung to life hours ago, was wrapped around him like a damn security blanket. Her long, slender arm draped over his torso, her fingers curled against his ribs as if she had meant to hold on to him but lost strength halfway through. One of her legs had slipped between his, the sharp contrast of her still cool skin pressing against the warmth of his own. And then there was her face, nestled against his neck. Frank's body tensed. What the hell? His first instinct was to pry her off, to put some much-needed space between them, but the moment he shifted, she stirred. Her grip on his shirt tightened. Her breath, cooler than a human's, brushed against his collarbone. He stayed completely still, his mind racing. He had left her by the fire. He had made sure of it. She had been curled up, tucked under blankets, recovering from what should have been a fatal level of cold. Yet somehow, in the middle of the night, she had found him. Frank clenched his jaw, staring at the wooden ceiling beams. He should wake her. He should demand an explanation, but something about the way she clung to him, so unconsciously, so desperately, made his throat tighten. She hadn't done this out of some strange alien custom. This wasn't instinct or habit. This was survival. A slow exhale escaped him. He had spent years convincing himself he didn't care about anyone, that human connection was a thing of the past. Yet here he was, lying awake in the dark, feeling something dangerously close to protectiveness for a woman who wasn't even human. He should move. He had to move. But before he could, her breathing changed. The soft rise and fall of her chest grew steadier, her fingers twitching slightly against his ribs. Then, slowly, she stirred. Frank forced himself to remain still as she woke. Her golden eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. For a moment she didn't seem to register where she was, her pupils dilating as they adjusted to the dim light. Then, her gaze locked onto his. They stared at each other. Frank expected panic, maybe embarrassment. Instead, she simply watched him, calm and assessing, as if she were still deciding whether or not he was real. Then, in a voice rough with sleep, she murmured, "You are warm." Frank exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I got that part." She didn't move away. If anything, she seemed more content now that he was awake, as if that simple fact reassured her. Frank gritted his teeth. "You want to explain why you're in my bed?" She blinked slowly. "I was cold." His eye twitched. "You were by the fire." "The fire is not alive." Frank frowned. "What does that mean?" She tilted her head slightly, considering her words. "Fire gives heat, but it does not hold, it does not protect. Your warmth is constant." Frank ran a hand down his face. "Unbelievable. You can't regulate your body temperature, can you?" She hesitated, then shook her head once. "Not like you." Something heavy settled in Frank's chest. He had assumed she had just been suffering from hypothermia, but if her body naturally struggled to retain heat, that meant she wasn't just trying to get warm. She was trying to stay alive. He exhaled slowly. "Damn it." She studied him, her expression unreadable. "Are you angry?" Frank opened his mouth to say yes, that he was frustrated, that he hadn't signed up for this, that he had built a life away from people for a reason. But the words didn't come, because the truth was, he wasn't angry. He was concerned. And that realization pissed him off more than anything. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, untangling himself from her hold as gently as possible. The cold hit instantly, but he ignored it, rubbing a hand over his face. "You should have woken me up," he muttered. She watched him carefully, still lying where he had left her. "Would you have allowed it?" Frank hesitated. She had him there. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Look, if this is going to be a thing..." "It is." His brow furrowed. "You didn't even let me finish." "I did not need to." Frank huffed a quiet laugh despite himself. "Unbelievable." She shifted slightly, sitting up against the pillows. The blanket slipped off her shoulders, exposing the blue skin of her collarbone, and for the first time Frank noticed something else. Scars. Not just one or two, dozens. Thin, pale lines ran along her arms and shoulders, barely visible against her iridescent skin. Some were jagged, others precise. They weren't recent, but they told a story. A story he didn't have the right to ask about. Not yet. But it changed something. This wasn't just a woman who had crash-landed into his life by accident. This was someone who had survived something. And suddenly, the way she clung to warmth, to him, made more sense. She had lived through cold before. She wasn't going to let it take her now. Frank exhaled sharply and stood. "All right, I'm making coffee. You want more tea?" She blinked, as if surprised by the offer. Then, slowly, she nodded. Frank moved toward the kitchen, still trying to convince himself that this wasn't a mistake, that taking her in, keeping her here, wasn't going to unravel everything he had built for himself. But as he poured water into the kettle, he already knew the truth. It was too late for that. Frank had always been a man of simple rules. Keep your distance, don't let people in, never let your guard down. Out here, in the wilderness, rules kept him alive. They gave him structure, control. But ever since she had fallen from the sky, those rules had been unraveling. And now, as he stood in his cabin, watching her sip tea with delicate fingers, wrapped in his blanket, golden eyes flickering in the firelight, he realized something. He wasn't sure he wanted them anymore. She looked up suddenly, her gaze sharp despite the exhaustion still clinging to her. "You are staring," Frank grunted. "Think." She tilted her head slightly, studying him like she was trying to decipher a language she hadn't quite mastered. You do that often?" He huffed a quiet laugh. "Yeah, well, you give me a lot to think about." She said nothing at first. Then, softly, she murmured, "Do you regret helping me?" Frank frowned. He hadn't expected that. He should have. He had given her every reason to think he was hesitant about this whole situation. And he was. But regret? No, he admitted. She seemed to consider his answer carefully, then set the empty mug down. You are cautious. You do not trust me. Frank exhaled slowly. I don't trust anyone. She nodded as if she had already known that. Because you have been betrayed before. Frank's muscles tensed. She was watching him too closely now, reading him too well. He didn't like that. But instead of snapping at her, he simply asked, And you? You trust me? A pause. Then, I do not know. Fair enough. Frank ran a hand through his hair. Listen, if we're going to be stuck here together, we need to set some ground rules. She blinked. Rules? Yeah, first rule, no sneaking into my bed at night. She didn't react the way he expected. No embarrassment, no flustered apologies. She simply tilted her head again and asked, Why? Frank clenched his jaw. Because it's weird. She frowned slightly. You said I could ask if I needed warmth. But I was cold. Doesn't mean you crawl into my bed without warning. She considered that for a moment, then, with a hint of mischief in her voice, said, Would you prefer I warn you first? Frank groaned. That's not the point. Her lips pressed together in what might have been the ghost of a smirk. I do not understand your objection. You provided warmth. I sought it. I do not see the problem. Frank rubbed a hand down his face. Of course you don't. She shifted slightly under the blanket, exposing the smooth curve of her collarbone, the deep blue of her skin glowing in the firelight. Her golden eyes never left his. Your warmth is different, she said softly. Frank swallowed. What does that mean? She hesitated, then, choosing her words carefully, she murmured, Fire fades, it does not hold. But you linger. Frank didn't know what to say to that. She was too close again. Not physically, she was still seated on the couch, blanket draped over her shoulders. But there was something in the air between them, something he wasn't ready to name. He needed to break it, now. Second rule, he said roughly, forcing his voice to stay steady. No more dodging my questions. She tensed slightly. I have answered when I can. You admitted you're hiding something. Silence. Then, finally, she said, Yes. Frank exhaled through his nose. And? She looked down at the empty mug, fingers tightening around the handle. Then, finally, she whispered, I was not meant to survive. The words sent a sharp jolt through his chest. What? She swallowed hard, still not looking at him. My ship. It was never meant to land. It was meant to burn. Frank stared at her. You're saying someone wanted you dead? She nodded once. Frank felt something dark settle in his gut. He had assumed she had crashed by accident, that she had fallen from the sky because of some freak mechanical failure. But if someone had tried to kill her, then this wasn't over. And neither of them was safe. He inhaled deeply, trying to push away the protective instinct rising in his chest. Who? She shook her head. I do not know, but if they learn I am still alive, they will come. Frank's grip tightened into fists. This was exactly what he had avoided for years. Trouble, danger, entanglements. But looking at her now, at the way her hands trembled slightly despite her calm exterior, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't letting anyone finish what they started. Not while she was under his roof. Before he could say anything, she moved. In one fluid motion, she rose from the couch and stepped toward him, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. Frank barely had time to react before she was standing in front of him, close enough that he could feel the faint chill still clinging to her skin. She placed a hand against his chest, right over his heart. You are steady, she murmured. Frank swallowed hard. Yeah, so I've heard. She searched his face, her golden eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite read. Then, slowly, she tilted her chin up. Frank saw it coming, and he didn't stop it. Her lips brushed against his, soft but searching, hesitant but intent. It wasn't just a kiss, it was a question. And without thinking, Frank answered. He pulled her closer, deepening the kiss, his hands finding the curve of her waist. She pressed against him, drinking in his heat like it was the only thing keeping her alive. Maybe it was. Her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer, and for the first time in years, Frank let himself forget the rules, forget the isolation, forget the past. Because right now, in this moment, none of it mattered. All that mattered was her. And the warmth they shared. Frank wasn't sure what woke him first, the pale morning light seeping through the cabin window or the warmth pressed against his side. For a moment, he wasn't in the mountains, he wasn't alone. The past didn't weigh on him like a ghost he couldn't shake. Then the events of the night came rushing back. The kiss. The way she had melted against him, drinking in his heat, as if she had found something she had been searching for. The way he had given in, breaking every rule he had spent years enforcing. Frank exhaled slowly, staring at the ceiling, willing his heartbeat to slow. Beside him she stirred. Her silver hair, still tangled from sleep, fanned out over his pillow. Her blue skin, faintly iridescent in the morning light, was warmer now, a softness to it that hadn't been there before. One of her hands rested lightly on his chest, just over his heart, as if she had fallen asleep counting his breaths. Frank let himself watch her for a moment. She wasn't human, but in sleep she looked just as fragile as one. Her golden eyes flickered open. For a moment she simply stared at him, as if still processing where she was. Then, slowly, she pressed her palm a little firmer against his chest, as if grounding herself. "You are still here," she murmured. Frank arched a brow. "Yeah, where else would I be?" She studied him for a moment before responding. "Some men would have left." Frank scoffed. "I'm not most men." A hint of something close to amusement flickered in her gaze. "No, you are not. You are not good." Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but charged, like something unspoken hung between them, waiting to be addressed. Frank exhaled and ran a hand through his hair. "So?" "Last night." She nodded, watching him carefully. "It changed something." He swallowed. "Yeah." "You regret it?" Frank hesitated. Regret? No. But things were complicated now. He had spent years building a life that kept people at a distance. Now there was someone in his bed. Someone who wasn't even from this world. And the worst part? It didn't feel wrong. Frank exhaled sharply. "No, I don't." She studied him carefully, as if searching for cracks in his words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Good." Frank smirked slightly. "That's it? Just good?" Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "Yes. Good." She started to sit up, but the second she shifted, her body tensed. A sharp inhale slipped from her lips, and she pressed a hand to her ribs. Frank was up in an instant, his instincts firing before he could think. "What is it?" She shook her head, but he could see the tightness in her expression. "It is nothing." Frank narrowed his eyes. "You're a bad liar." She sighed, as if debating whether or not to tell him. Then, finally, she moved the blanket aside, revealing her side. Frank swore under his breath. A deep bruise bloomed along her ribs, dark against her blue skin. "How the hell did you—" His eyes widened as the realization hit. The crash. She had been thrown from the wreckage, and he hadn't even noticed. Guilt settled in his stomach. "Why didn't you say something before?" She met his gaze, unflinching. "It was not the worst pain I have felt." Frank clenched his jaw. "That's not the point. She watched him for a long moment, then exhaled. I did not want to seem weak. Frank stared at her, then without a word he reached for his medical kit. She frowned. Frankly, "Shut up and let me help you." To his surprise, she didn't argue. She let him press careful fingers against her ribs, checking for breaks. She didn't flinch, but her breathing hitched slightly when he reached the deepest part of the bruise. Frank exhaled through his nose. "Nothing's broken, but you're damn lucky. You need to take it easy." She nodded, but he could tell she wouldn't listen. He sighed. "Promise me?" She blinked, as if the request surprised her. Then, finally, she nodded. "I promise." Frank wrapped the bruise carefully, his hand steady despite the heat simmering between them. She watched him the entire time, her gaze unreadable. When he finished, he sat back, rubbing his jaw. "All right, that should help." She studied him for a long moment, then softly said, "You're gentle." Frank huffed a laugh. "Don't let that get around." She smiled, small but real. For the first time, she looked at peace. Frank exhaled, running a hand down his face. He was in deeper than he had ever meant to be. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he minded. Frank had spent years preparing for the worst. Out here in the wild, survival was simple. It was about firewood and fresh water, about keeping the roof patched before the storms rolled in, about knowing which sounds in the night meant danger and which meant the forest breathing. Survival was not waking up with an alien woman tangled in his sheets. It was not tracing the curve of her shoulder with his fingertips before realizing what he was doing. It was not watching golden eyes flicker open, filled with something unspoken. And yet, here he was. Zura stretched beneath the blankets, exhaling a soft, satisfied sigh. "I slept well." Frank smirked. "Yeah, I noticed." She rolled onto her side, resting her chin against her palm as she studied him. "You did not." Frank huffed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Not used to company." Zarella watched him carefully. "You do not regret it?" Frank exhaled, staring at the wooden beams above. "No." She reached out, tracing her fingers along the back of his hand. "Good." They lay there in silence, the fire in the hearth reduced to glowing embers. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the world outside heavy with snow. Eventually, Frank forced himself to sit up. "We should check the crash site." Zarella tensed beside him. Frank noticed. He turned to face her. "Something I should know?" She hesitated. Then, slowly, she sat up as well, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "I told you before. My ship was not meant to survive. Neither was I." Frank studied her, waiting. She exhaled. If the wreckage remains, it may still hold a signal." Frank frowned. "A distress beacon?" She shook her head. "A warning. If they come, it will not be to rescue me." Frank's chest tightened. He had known, deep down, that this wasn't over, that whoever had tried to kill her wouldn't just give up. Still, hearing it confirmed made his stomach churn. He stood, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Then we'd better move before someone else does." Zir Allah rose as well, though not as quickly. Frank caught the slight wince as she straightened, his jaw tightening. "Ribs still bothering you?" She exhaled through her nose. "They are healing." Frank didn't believe that for a second, but he didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed an extra coat and tossed it to her. She caught it easily, her movements far more fluid than they had been the night before. He narrowed his eyes. "You recover fast." A ghost of a smirk touched her lips. "I adapt." Frank grunted. "Noted." They stepped outside into the biting cold. The snow stretched untouched in every direction, save for a faint indentation where the storm had buried her initial impact. No tracks. Frank wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Zerla fell into step beside him as they made their way toward the crater. The silence between them wasn't awkward, but charged, like they both knew the peace of last night had been temporary. As they reached the site, Frank slowed. The wreckage was still there, partially buried, jagged metal and scorched earth peeking through the snow. But something was off. Zerla saw it too. She stiffened, eyes narrowing. Frank raised his rifle. "Tell me I'm not crazy." Zerla didn't answer. She stepped forward, kneeling beside a piece of the hull. Her fingers traced a faint scorch mark, but not from the crash. The burn pattern was too precise. Frank's stomach dropped. "That's from a weapon, isn't it?" Zerala's expression darkened. "Yes." Frank scanned the tree line, his grip tightening on the rifle. "Then someone's already been here." Zerala exhaled, pressing her palm against the wreckage. A faint hum resonated beneath her touch, the metal pulsing once before flickering out. "Signal is dead," she murmured. "They silenced it." Frank clenched his jaw. "Which means they know you're alive." She met his gaze, golden eyes steady. "Yes." Frank swore under his breath. He had spent years avoiding trouble, keeping his head down, staying out of things that weren't his concern. But this wasn't something he could walk away from. And maybe, just maybe, he didn't want to. He exhaled sharply, lowering the rifle. "Then we don't wait for them to come to us." Zerala blinked. "You wish to leave?" Frank smirked. "I don't wish to. But if we're going to have company, I'd rather not be sitting on my ass when they show up." Zerala studied him, something unreadable flickering in her gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Then we move." Frank turned toward the cabin, already making a mental checklist of what they'd need. Zerla fell into step beside him, and as they walked, she reached out, curling her fingers around his. Frank hesitated for only a second. Then, without a word, he held on. The storm had passed, but something heavier hung in the air. Frank and Zerala moved through the trees in silence, their breaths misting in the cold morning air. The wreckage behind them told a story neither of them wanted to face. Someone had found the crash site first, someone who didn't want survivors. They didn't have long before whoever silenced that beacon came looking. Frank's grip tightened around his rifle as he led them toward a ridge overlooking the valley. From here he could see for miles, his cabin, the thick stretch of forest, the long road that wound down the mountain. Everything he had built, everything that had been his world for the last few years. He was about to leave it behind. Beside him, Zerala watched him carefully. "You are thinking of staying?" Frank exhaled sharply. "Doesn't matter what I want. They'll come, won't they?" Zerala's golden eyes flickered with something unreadable. "Yes." Frank ran a hand through his hair, staring at the horizon. Damn it. He had built this life to escape war, to escape the weight of responsibility. Now here he was, about to throw himself into a fight that wasn't his. But then again, maybe it was. He turned to look at her. She stood tall despite her injuries, her silver hair catching the morning light, her skin warmed by the rising sun. She was strong, resilient. But beneath it all, he saw what she wouldn't say. She was tired of running. And Frank? He was tired of watching people he cared about get left behind. His jaw tightened. "All right." Zerala frowned. Frank nodded once. "We go. We leave the mountain. We figure out what's coming and how to stop it." She studied him, searching for hesitation. Finding none, she nodded. "We will need supplies." Frank smirked. "Lucky for you, I'm a paranoid bastard." They returned to the cabin quickly, grabbing only what they needed. Ammunition, food, medical supplies. Frank worked efficiently, but there was something strange about packing his life into a single bag. When he reached the fireplace, he hesitated. He had spent years in this cabin. Every piece of it was him. The rough-hewn walls, the battered furniture, the firewood he had stacked just days ago. It was the closest thing to home he had ever known. Zirala's voice was quiet. "You do not have to leave this behind." Frank exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I do." She stepped closer. "Because of me." Frank turned to her. "Because of them." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. He reached for his coat, slinging the bag over his shoulder. "Let's go." They stepped outside just as the wind shifted. Frank stilled. Something wasn't right. The forest was too quiet. Zirala must have sensed it too, because she stiffened beside him, her golden eyes scanning the tree line. Frank's instincts flared. Years of military training snapped into place as he reached for his rifle, positioning himself between her and the woods. Then he saw it. A shadow moved between the trees. Too fast, too deliberate. Frank's stomach dropped. They were already here. He didn't have time to warn Zirala before the first shot rang out. He grabbed her, yanking her down behind the porch railing just as something whizzed past his ear. Snow exploded where the bullet struck. Frank swore. "You recognize them?" Zirala's expression darkened. "Yes." "Friends of yours?" "No." Frank gritted his teeth, peering through the gaps in the wood. At least 3 figures, maybe more, moving in a formation he recognized all too well. They weren't here to negotiate. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Then he turned to Zirala. "How fast can you run?" She frowned. "I do not plan to." "Asking what you plan to do, I'm asking how fast you are." She held his gaze for a beat, then nodded. "Fast enough." Frank exhaled sharply. "Good. When I say go, you head for the ridge. Stick to the trees. Move low. Don't stop." Zirala's jaw tightened. "And you?" Frank smirked, checking his rifle. "I've got a welcoming party to handle." She stared at him, something flickering behind her eyes. Then, to his surprise, she leaned forward. "Quick!" "Certain," and kissed him. Not like last night. Not hesitant, not testing. This was solid, a promise, a tether. When she pulled back, her golden eyes burned. "Do not get yourself killed, Frank." Frank's smirk widened. "Wouldn't dream of it." Then, before he could second-guess himself, he turned and fired the first shot. By the time Frank reached the ridge, his knuckles were raw and his breathing sharp. Snow clung to his clothes, dirt smeared across his hands. But he was alive. And more importantly, so was she. Zirala stood at the edge of the overlook, staring at the valley below. She turned when she heard him approach, relief flashing across her face before she masked it. Frank exhaled, rolling his shoulder. "Well, that was fun." Zirala arched a brow. "Your definition of fun is questionable." Frank chuckled. "You're not wrong." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't heavy this time. It wasn't the silence of 2 people holding back. It was the silence of understanding. Zirala glanced back at the valley. "They will not stop." Frank followed her gaze. "No, they won't." She turned to him fully. "Then neither will we." Frank studied her. Just days ago she had been a stranger. A freezing, injured, alien stranger who had crash-landed into his life. Now she was something else. Something his. He smirked. "Guess we better keep moving then." She nodded, stepping beside him. "Together?" Frank reached for her hand, curling his fingers around hers. "Yeah, together." As they walked away from the only home he had ever known, Frank realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't leaving something behind. He was going somewhere, and he wasn't going alone.